Welcome, everyone, to Healthy Minds, Bright Futures: How to Navigate Mental Health and Build Support. This is the podcast where we discuss how clinicians can best work with educators and families to meet children's mental health needs and give them the strong start they need to be successful in school and in life. Today, our topic is ADHD, otherwise known as Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. According to the CDC, this condition affects millions of children, yet rates of diagnosis vary significantly across the U.S. ADHD isn't rare, but it's also complex, and treatment approaches are not always clear-cut or consistent. We're going to talk about strategies that clinicians can use to work with schools and with caregivers to identify kiddos who may benefit from screening, and how to implement classroom support so that students with ADHD can thrive. I'm joined today by Tyler Vassar, EDS. He's a licensed school psychologist and an assessment consultant with Pearson Clinical Assessments. Pearson is the world's largest educational company. Tyler, thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely, Rose. I appreciate the opportunity to come on your show.
Absolutely. Well, so to start, let's talk about the variance that we see in these ADHD diagnosis rates, because we know it varies a lot between different states, but even within states and within communities. So, why do you think that is the case, and what can we do about it?
I would say one of the biggest factors, at least in my opinion, would be access to healthcare. So you look at maybe more urban areas that have a plethora of pediatricians, child psychologists, school psychologists, and other school-based mental health professionals. They have access to those professionals. They have more awareness as well, which can lead to a higher referral rate for assessment and, subsequently a higher diagnosis rate as well. Whereas if you look at children in underserved areas, which, can often be more rural, that might have fewer of these resources, that can also play a factor and lead to underdiagnosis as well. Socioeconomic and cultural factors can play into this too, where different communities might view mental health and behavioral challenges differently. There could be stigma or cultural beliefs that could also discourage families from seeking health. Language barriers, mistrust of medical systems can also play a role. And also, the way in which ADHD can exhibit itself can vary too, which can lead to difference in diagnosis rates, particularly when we look at how ADHD exhibits itself in girls versus boys. So, boys might, exhibit more of that quote unquote problematic or challenging behaviors, such as getting out of your seat or otherwise causing classroom disruptions that can really draw the attention of the teacher to seeing and might, lead to higher chances or instances of being referred for an evaluation. Whereas in girls, they might present themselves or it might present itself as spacing out or, kind of being off in your own world or daydreaming. And teachers might not notice that behavior as much as hyperactivity, right? It's not as much in your face. Think of like the squeaky wheel gets the grease, that old saying, to where they're not necessarily going to see those behaviors as much because they're more internalized. And clinicians also might interpret diagnostic criteria differently. So they're really, I'd love to say there's one reason and there's one, easy fix to why these rates can vary so much, but it's really not one factor. It's kind of a multitude of things.
Yeah, no, those are really good points, especially kind of that difference between how it presents in girls versus boys. That idea of like the squeaky wheel getting the grease, and if someone is jumping out of their seat, then that is an impetus to a teacher to kind of have to address that a little bit more. To follow on with exactly what you just said, wish there was like something to point to, and there isn't. There's many things, not just one. So that second half of my first question, tricky as it is, well, what can we do about the variance in these diagnosis rates?
I do think, kind of going back onto my original point about access to quality mental health care, is just improving that access to quality mental health care would probably be the most important thing, especially, in those underserved areas where families might not have the same access to those professionals. I think telehealth is a great option and something that I would love to see, us expand, in communities where you might live 45 minutes away from a doctor, or you quite literally cannot afford to take off work to take your child to the doctor, or taking them out of school isn't feasible. Telehealth can be a wonderful option to expand access to those resources. I also think no one would disagree with me in saying that we could definitely do with increased funding for school-based mental health services, right? I think that's important too. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. And then
Absolutely.
finally, I do think investing in, training as well for our educators and our school staff, not necessarily for the purpose of diagnosing, but for helping to make sure that we're able to recognize the signs of some attention challenges and executive function challenges.
So that's a really important distinction that you just mentioned, not diagnosing, but recognizing, right?
Right. I do want to make a note here that, as least as far as I'm aware, educators and school psychologists aren't actually diagnosing ADHD in the schools. That's a medical diagnosis typically made by a medical provider. But we do play important roles in this, especially classroom teachers. Outside of a parent, they're most likely going to be the person that spends the most time with a particular child.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So let's kind of build on that. So what can clinicians like school psychs like yourself and educators do to improve screening capabilities?
So I think teacher support and collaboration would probably be the most crucial thing because, as I mentioned, we don't really formally screen for ADHD the way that you might, let's say, for vision or hearing. Right at the beginning of the year, they send the class, through to the school nurse to have that tested. It's not really the same way for ADHD. So I think training and supporting, professional development to recognize the early signs of attention executive function challenges can be important. As I said before, not just focusing on the hyperactivity or the things that are obviously, visible, but also maybe things like not following through on instructions or organizing materials. Think about, the kiddo you've seen with the backpack of overflowing just loose papers, or the locker that everything
Right.
falls out of when they open it up, right? So those might not be as obvious if it's not disruptive to everyone else in the class. And so when educators can notice those more nuanced patterns, especially when they persist across time and settings, that's where they can bring this information or this case to the problem solving team or RTI team, school counselor, or even school psychologist. So I think that collaboration and communication between teachers, educators, and the evaluation team is so important, especially when we're looking at, frequency and context, building a bigger picture. So we would look, so for example, maybe there are behavioral concerns with the student, but it's only the math teacher that's reporting them, right? Reading and writing, we're having no problems. Music class, we're great, but in math, we're really struggling here. Is it that there is an attention or executive function challenge here that we need to investigate? Or could there possibly be a learning disability, right? A specific learning disability in math that might be the root cause here. And so we get that context from collaboration.
I think that's a really, really good point, that trying to drill down into, is it an issue with not understanding the material
Right.
for whatever reason versus, yeah, an executive function or inability to control one's impulses or something like that, just kind of at a broad level. So let's kind of dig into that a little bit more, because I think everyone would agree that teachers already have so much on their plate. And so putting something else on them, "Oh, yeah, you gotta figure this out too," is the last thing that we would all want to do. So, what can, school psychs and others do to ease that burden with respect to awareness about these ADHD symptoms?
I think we can help in a couple of factors, not just with awareness of ADHD symptoms, but also once a student might have been identified and, is receiving supports, is that we can help with intervention strategies. Hopefully, if a school psych's caseload isn't too heavy, they are able to be in the classroom, maybe making general observations, or, they're able to come to recess, or they're in the school assemblies, right, to where they're able to make observations, help with interventions, because that's what we're trained to do, is to not only, there's an assessment side obviously to the school psychologist world, but there's also a consulting side to it as well, to where we want to work collaboratively with teachers, especially after, a student might be identified, to help bring suggestions on what's working, what's not working, because Hopefully that will also help ease the case or the plate of the teacher, right? If we're able to work on maybe reducing the challenging behaviors of some students or increasing those the positive ones that we want to see, that's going to help ease the burden of the teacher as well.
Absolutely. And that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is about behavioral classroom management. And I imagine a lot of our listeners have heard about this. But for those who haven't or maybe want to learn more, Tyler, tell me behavioral classroom management. What is it and why is it valuable?
I'm sure there's many different, definitions of it, but I'd say generally it's a structured approach to encouraging positive behaviors in the classroom, which can be especially helpful for students that might have been diagnosed with ADHD because it's involves setting clear expectations, teaching those expectations, and then consistently enforcing and reinforcing them. The my particular favorite kind of method with if this is instead of focusing on punishment or focusing solely on reducing the behaviors that we don't want to see in the classroom, we're working on making it our goal to promote the behaviors that we do want to see, catching that positive behavior so that I'm able to reward it. And so looking at things like behaviors like staying on task, following the directions, or using coping strategies. And one of my favorite examples was that I heard from a teacher in grad school was that if a teacher notices a student that's exhibiting challenging or undesired behavior, like out of seat behavior, right? Instead of calling attention to that, Johnny, you need to get back in your seat. Rather, why don't I look for someone who's exhibiting in seat behavior so that I can, essentially reward them, which thank you, Susie, so much for staying in your seat and paying attention to the lesson right now. You're doing a great job. Where so now Johnny sees, wait, Susie got attention for doing this, for sitting in the seat rather than being out of the seat. If attention is the function of the, or is the function of the behavior, maybe if I sit down, the teacher will tell me that I did a good job, or I'll earn a point, or whatever the reward system, might be in the classroom there to where that can help not only with improving, the behaviors of the student, but helping them work on self-correcting their behavior rather than the teacher having to call them out to then, exhibit the correct behavior. They're correcting it themselves, which is super important, in my opinion, to building self-resiliency in those students that might struggle.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. Giving them the like support and the tactics that they need to be in control of their own behavior and not always looking for or expecting it to come from an external source because that teacher's not always going to be there.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think this kind of ties back into that importance of training and professional development that we were talking about earlier because in a way, in the heat of the moment, it might be tough for a teacher to hold back from saying, "Johnny, get back in your seat." And to make
Right.
that switch to saying, "Susie, thank you for staying in your seat." So yeah, does this kind of underline that importance of PD that we talked about?
Yes, I would definitely say it's not something to just throw at teachers, expect them to be able to do right away because, ultimately they're there to teach, right, the students.
Right.
So they've got their lesson plans, they have their things that they're focused on. And now you're saying, I also have to simultaneously be able to remember all of these things and do that. It's certainly not easy. And so I think that's where the rest of the team, comes into play here, be it school psychs, educational diagnosticians, SLPs, occupational therapists, physical therapists, school counselors, social workers, right? Everyone in the schools can advocate for those teachers to get the training that they need to be successful in the classroom. And one distinction I do want to make too is it doesn't necessarily have to be professional development from the aspect of, we're bringing in someone from the outside to help train our teachers or train our staff. That's also where the school psychologists or those other members of the team that I mentioned can come into play because we're also, we're experts in these areas to where we can provide that training ourselves internally within the school district. And so it also can help build upon that collaboration too, right? Which is we're not, bringing someone, like I said, in from the outside to do this training. It's the local, the school psychologist for the elementary schools coming in and doing a workshop maybe in the first couple of weeks before the kiddos return, right? About here's some ideas and examples, let me know how they work for you throughout the school year here so that we can build upon that because I think it really can help to avoid burnout, which is very, very common in the schools, for teacher burnout and to reduce stress because we're empowering the teachers to feel like they're in control of the classroom.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that. I love that idea too. So, everyone in the educational community, again, I don't think this will be controversial, all need to advocate for each other, that this really is a team approach. And related to that, with ADHD specifically are comorbidities or other co-occurring conditions. And that's part of what makes ADHD so complex, isn't that right?
Right.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, so how can, again, sticking with our school psychs and the team members who you'd mentioned are other clinicians, how can you address those possibilities?
So, just to start with, like you had said, they're related to ADHD is comorbidities, right? Studies or general research shows that roughly two-thirds of students that are diagnosed with or identified as having ADHD are going to have at least one other co-occurring condition. Most frequent ones would be anxiety, depression, or specific learning disabilities, and then also sometimes autism spectrum disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, as some people might know it. And so that can complicate the picture in a few ways as far as evaluations go. And I like to think of it kind of, the old chicken and egg situation, which came first. Is it the inability to pay attention or the struggles with executive function and attention that's leading to the academic difficulties? Or is it a learning disability in a specific area that is then leading to the student exhibiting symptoms that would look like an attention disorder? So, thinking back to my math example here, is it that the child is struggling so much with the material that they start exhibiting behaviors that aren't beneficial in the classroom, like getting out of their seat or talking to other students, thinking like, I'm sitting here, I don't understand this material, I don't get it, I'm not able to do it. The teacher showed me 5 different examples, I'm still not getting it. This is so frustrating. I'd rather talk to my friend that's sitting right here during math than deal like I'm so frustrated and this is not enjoyable in any way, right? Or is it that they can't pay attention or are really struggling to pay attention first to learning the material, right? Which one is it? And in some cases, it can actually be both, right? Which is an additional complication there. And
Right,
so that's
right.
why it's super necessary to look at the child as a whole when you're, even evaluations, especially, we need to make sure that we're not so focused on, ironically, so focused on looking at potential lack of focus that we're not seeing other potential concerns that a student might be showing.
I think that's such a good point, and that actually leads really nicely to my next question, which is about some of these tools. So, what's out there that clinicians and educators can use to get that picture, that understanding of the whole child? What are some Pearson assessments that they can use for this?
Right. So, like I said, we're not necessarily screening for ADHD in schools, but we would be looking at the symptomology of ADHD. So, think executive function or executive dysfunction and concerns with attention or focus. And, the assessment that's probably most familiar to clinicians listening now would be the BASC-3, which provides a broad view of students' emotional behavioral functioning, including areas of attention, hyperactivity, and self regulation. And so, for those unfamiliar, it's a rating form that's used for teachers and parents. And depending on the age of the student, if they're old enough, they can also fill out their own personal rating scale. So it's super, super useful for gathering data across settings. And one of the factors that makes this assessment so valuable is its broad scope. So we've been talking quite a bit about more, negative factors, right? But this assessment also measures positive ones, such as social skills, adaptability, and resiliency, which I'd mentioned being so crucial. And so that's part of the reason that assessment is so valuable and so widely used. And then there are some more narrow band rating scales also that can be helpful. One of which is the Connors 4. It's a very widely used behavior rating scale that, again, is completed by parents, teachers, or caregivers, and sometimes the students themselves. And it looks at attention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and emotional regulation. And another kind of bonus factor for this assessment is that its criteria are aligned with the DSM-5, which is really important when you're bringing that information to medical providers because they're most oftentimes using that as part of their diagnostic process. And then I would say finally, probably the Brown Executive Function and Attention Scales. It's also known as the Brown EFA, which focuses on executive function difficulties that are often seen in ADHD. So think things like organization, memory, task initiation, and it can be especially useful when inattentive ADHD type is suspected, right? There's 3 types. There's the hyperactivity, the inattentive, and then the combined type. And so when we're looking at those behaviors, we want to make sure we're also measuring or looking at ones that might not be as outwardly visible or outwardly problematic. And so that's just, a few of those tools there that are helpful for clinicians and educators. They're actually also available on Q Global, which is Pearson's web-based system for administering, scoring, and reporting assessments. So you have the option to use the paper forms where they would fill it out with a pen or a pencil, and you could either hand score that or come back and enter in that information onto the web form and you can run a score report. But we also have a slightly more convenient option where you're able to send out a digital usage via Q Global, where it'll be sent to the parent or the teacher's email, where they can open it up just like any survey that you've ever done before, and they're able to click through the options and send it back. That way, you're not risking losing a form or it being misplaced or something along those lines. It's able to just be sent out digitally and come right back.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's huge. Just I mean, because everyone is used to getting a Survey Monkey. Everybody's used to
Right.
getting an Evite
Exactly.
or something, something like that, as opposed to shuffling back and forth with paper forms. There's definitely value to both approaches, but I think having that digital capability, especially as we're talking, these teachers already have a lot on their plate. So if it's as easy as just clicking on
Absolutely.
a link, that helps a lot.
Yeah, it's much more convenient, and it was one of those I always felt so bad going to the teacher break room to their boxes and giving them yet another piece of paper that they have to fill out because I know that it's not fun to do. So sometimes it can be a little bit easier and convenient if you can just, couple of clicks of a button and you're done.
100%. So let's say that, having gone through this process, a child is screened for ADHD. They've gone through the medical diagnosis, receive a diagnosis from a doctor or a medical provider, and they qualify for a 504 plan. What then?
So that is a really good question because obviously the main focus here we've been talking about is recognizing and identifying. And okay, now we've identified, that's only part of the process, right? The next step is to work on supporting that student. So when I hear a 504 plan or an IEP, I like to think of those as a support plan for the student. What are we going to collectively do as this team to support the child from here on, now that we might have a better understanding of the reasoning behind why these behaviors may or may not be exhibited. And so that starts with interventions, right? That's what we would want to put into place. And so that's where the clinicians would come in to be able to support the teachers. I'd mentioned that previously, of giving ideas and strategies for supporting and coping strategies and things like that. And there's actually, going back to the BAS3, which we had mentioned, there is an option for a report that you can run that actually provides intervention recommendations. So that can at least be, maybe a starting point for the team if that's an assessment that was used. So that's something to think about as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, having a starting point for an IEP. And that leads to my next question, which is, working with those caregivers that because I love that idea of, hey, the screening is only the first step. It's actually about how do you support the whole child. So, how can clinicians and educators work with caregivers, once it's time to make that formal intervention for a student? What are some best practices for these folks?
So when we're looking at the IEP team, I just want to kind of first start and say that it's actually legally required under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that caregivers, parents are full members of the team. So not just a, hey, we're letting you know we did this, evaluation. Here's what we're going to do. Again, just so you know, right? They have to be part of it collaboratively. But even beyond, legal requirements, the school, the educator, the team wants to build a genuine relationship with these families of these students, because it's not going to make a huge difference, right? Who knows the child better than they do? Who's going to be able
Right.
to also report on how things are going, not just in the classroom but at home too, right? Because we're wanting to look at things across settings. And so I would say that, one of the more important things is to start those conversations with the family early, similar to how I mentioned I would recommend that school psychologists or other members of the evaluation team get the teachers involved as early in the process as possible. Let's get the parents involved early too. And I would also say for clinicians, especially when we're talking with parents and caregivers, to be careful, particularly to not use complex jargon that we might be very familiar with. I know I've thrown out several acronyms here during our session here, where I've tried to make sure that I was defining what they are, because you don't want a parent to feel like they're out of their realm, right? They might literally be sitting there at the table but not feel like they're part of the team. So I would want to make sure that they feel they're as important as anyone else is, because they are, and that their voice is heard as much as anyone else's is. So I want to make sure that they feel confident to speak up, to provide their suggestions. So I do think that's very important.
Yeah, yeah, no, I 100% agree. And as a parent, I mean, yes, we're having this conversation. We're throwing out BASC or IEP or things like that, but it is not in any way realistic to expect all parents to just know that when they walk in or to know those things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So no, I love the idea of just cutting back on the jargon, making that kind of how you lead when you're like actually in the room talking with those caregivers.
Absolutely.
So, Tyler, before we wrap up, I just want to ask one more question. Are you optimistic about the future of ADHD diagnoses and treatment approaches?
I am. I think that we're exhibiting better diagnostic practices and we're becoming more aware of things. The fact we're discussing this right now on the show, right? It is showing the trend that we're moving towards. You look at a number of years ago, we're working on understanding why girls might be less likely to be identified compared to boys. We have a better understanding of the symptomology and how that might be expressed in a different way. So, we're not only honing our practices and our awareness, but our evaluation tools are also becoming more powerful in terms of being more sensitive to what we're actually wanting to look at and to narrowly assess the specific symptoms. And so I think that right now we're in a good place, and I think that we're going to be in a better one in the future.
That's fantastic. Well, Tyler, I can't think of a better note to end on than, a positive view for the future. So thank you so, so much for your time and for your insights for our audience today.
Absolutely. Again, I appreciate so much the opportunity to hop on here and talk to you guys, and I hope that the listeners enjoy it.
Absolutely. And I also want to say thank you to our listeners, and we hope that you picked up some strategies that you can take back to your school or your practice. And if you'd like to learn more about supporting children with ADHD, Pearson will be hosting a virtual summit on ADHD on October 23rd of this year, 2025. It will bring together some of the top researchers and world-renowned experts on ADHD. You can find the registration info along with other events and assessment tools and resources for ADHD at the website pearsonassessments.com/ADHD. And I'll say that again. That first part's all one word, pearsonassessments.com/ADHD. Thank you again so much, and we hope you'll join us again soon on our next episode of Healthy Minds, Bright Futures.